Good evening. Thank you for viewing this program presented by the Sustainable Water Network. I'm Gary Beverly, a member of the steering committee. The Sustainable Water Network envisions a future where all citizens can live comfortable, economically secure lives with good jobs and enjoy healthy natural areas with flowing rivers and springs, healthy riparian habitats, vigorous wildlife, and outstanding recreational opportunities. Water is life. To sustain our lives and the environment for the future, we need sustainable water policies. And that is a task that the Sustainable Water Network is working on. To learn more about us, you could visit our website, azwaterfuture.org. Let me just quickly share my screen and show you that website, what it looks like. We live in the desert. We should act like it. You can explore the website. The address is azwaterfuture.org. Read our conservation vision and follow our activities and maybe join us. Now I'd like to introduce Linda Person, another steering committee member, who will explain more about the Sustainable Water Network.
10 water activists, environmental activists, and our group has been around for about 4 or 5 years. And we are trying to protect and save some of the remaining free-flowing rivers in Arizona. That's our passion. And we've come to the conclusion that the best way to do that is to try and get some kind of regulatory reform here in Arizona to modernize our water laws. So there's a lot of different groups out there, and it's a very complex issue. If any of you, have been following this or trying to understand this, there's a lot of players and a lot of laws, and but our approach is to try and get some kind of regulatory reform and modernization of our water laws in Arizona. It's an uphill battle. We encourage conservation and sustainability. We'd like to see more voices at the table. And it's a difficult political climate for us, in all honesty. And I always say this should not be a partisan issue. It really shouldn't, conserving rivers, but it seems to be right now. So our biggest hurdles have been the current political climate here. So, but last year and the year before, and also this year, we've tried to promote a bill called the Watershed Health Bill. It was SB 1480 last year, and that would have required the ADWR to start looking at individual watersheds and saying, hey, how much water needs to stay in this river to have a healthy watershed? Because currently surface water laws in Arizona are such that we can suck every last drop out of a river for a beneficial use and leave nothing, absolutely nothing for the environment. So we're looking for different ways to change that and improve that. Just one last quick thing, if anybody's following some of the things going on in the legislature, there's a bill out there, SB 1611. It is the Arizona Water Authority Act. And it is a very poorly thought out, in my opinion, massive behemoth of a bill that is looking to fund big water projects, pie in the sky type projects, a pipeline from Missouri, the Missouri River, massive desalination projects, things like that. So anyway, I personally think that's the wrong approach for Arizona right now. A lot of people do, but it's gaining traction. And if you want to be involved or take some kind of action, I would encourage you to talk to a state representative or your state senator and let them know how you feel about it. And just in general, let them know you support keeping some water flowing in our rivers. So with that, I will turn it back to Gary, and thanks very much for everyone's interest tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Linda. Today's presentation is being recorded and it'll be available on our YouTube channel. If you do not want your image captured, then turn off your video using the button in the bottom bar of the Zoom screen. And please remain muted to avoid background noise. Also, you can activate live transcription in the bottom menu of the in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. I just turned that on. So responding to questions is a major part of this presentation. Viewers can submit questions at any time using the chat button at the bottom bar of your screen. After the presentation, we will first respond to written questions and open up to verbal questions. So let's get started with today's presentation. Our speaker is Danielle Perry, PhD. She's a water resource geographer and director of the Free Flowing Rivers Lab at Northern Arizona University. The topic is policy and management options that can benefit the riverine ecosystems and biodiversity of Arizona. Welcome, Danielle, and thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm trying to share my screen here. So I am going to share and then swap the presentation. So once again, thank you for having me here this evening. I'm looking forward to sharing some of my research with you that we do in the Free Flowing Rivers Lab here at Northern Arizona University in the School of Earth and Sustainability. And I am going to present to you today some of the research that was just conducted on both the Colorado River basins and the Rio Grande basins, but we're going to focus in on Arizona rivers and the Colorado River basin today. There's a few studies that I'll be drawing from, but mainly one that was done for American rivers, which should be released soon. So, like I said, some research on free-flowing rivers and restoration needs, protection needs in the state of Arizona. Why do we need to protect rivers? And that's the important question. That's what all the politicians are going to want to know when you're coming to them saying, hey, we need to protect these rivers, we need to restore these rivers. And they're thinking, well, that's going to tap into our profit margin. So tell me a good reason why we need to protect these rivers. Well, the reason why is because rivers provide ecosystem services and goods to society that we all depend on, and the rivers do that freely. They provide services such as fresh water, scenery, vegetation, traditional and indigenous uses, recreation and education opportunities, cultural sites, places where we can go recreate ourselves and increase our well-being and our mental health, something that we've seen during the COVID pandemic, people flocking to any kind of water body that they can find in the state of Arizona to escape the realities of COVID. They provide fish and habitat for other types of wildlife, unique geologic structures, and habitat for biodiversity that's in crisis. They also provide natural infrastructure that mitigate floods and droughts. They allow for the movement of energy and matter, genes. They allow for species and genetic diversity. Free-flowing rivers enable our species to stay healthy because of that flow of genes in and through those connected riverine ecosystems. Unfortunately, around the world, and you can see the United States here, and you can see Arizona in particular stands out in the nice red lines, that less than 1/3 of the rivers in the world remain free flowing from their source to their sink. And we know that connectivity is key in our river ecosystems to keep them healthy for various reasons. So there has been a global movement in the last couple years to actually protect and restore the free-flowing rivers that exist, or to remove dams to restore them to a free-flowing nature. We've all heard about the 30 by 30 campaign. A lot of people in the United States think of that as being a US-driven policy to protect 30% of the country's lands and waters by the year 2030. At least 30%. The actual goal is 50% if we're thinking about climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. But this campaign actually came from the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which includes countries from all over the world, scientists, advocates, policymakers from all over the world who came up with this idea of protecting 30 by 30. In the United States, that campaign looks something like this. The idea of the America the Beautiful campaign is the way in which we in the US are trying to achieve that 30 by 30 goal. And in Arizona, there's a 30 by 30 campaign at the state level, and every state has its own 30 by 30 campaign. So this is a really critical time. The time is ripe for trying to meet those conservation needs that you all in this coalition or network have been trying to advance for many years. Now's the time to get behind this campaign. And the question is, how and why will we do that here in Arizona? So like I said, rivers provide ecosystem services. And a large part of my research agenda focuses on the National Wild and Scenic River System that is founded on the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. That policy is the premier policy in the world for protecting free-flowing rivers. If you're not familiar with it, to qualify as a wild and scenic river, it must be free-flowing, have a high water quality, or at least the ability for that water quality to be restored to a high nature. And it has to have at least one of these 8 outstandingly remarkable values that you see here in these little ovals off to the right-hand side of the screen. Well, my research shows that those ORVs, as they're called commonly, are actually ecosystem services. And you can see here that the provisioning services are that food and fresh water and genetic materials. Well, those things actually provide levels of security for our society. They provide food security for people who might be subsisting off of fish or wildlife that they're catching or hunting in the riparian areas. It can lead to public health benefits, resilience to climate change, etc. Regulating services can be something like climate regulation, because rivers and riparian areas are actually carbon sinks. They can serve to control and detoxify pollution in the environment. They can free-flowing rivers can actually help to control erosion and prevent natural hazards like floods, or to mitigate against drought in times of water scarcity. Supporting services, soil formation, which is critical for agriculture, for the health of the riparian areas, etc. And the benefits go on and on and on when we're talking about protecting free-flowing rivers. So when you're going out to talk to politicians or constituents that you're trying to convince to protect rivers, if you use these types of terminology, you have a better chance of getting support for your initiatives. Like I said, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is the premier policy, not just in this country, but it was actually the first river conservation policy, as we know conservation, in the world. And now places all over the world are actually building their own systems modeled after ours. There's great potential for expanding designations in this country under this 30 by 30 campaign. So here on the left, you can see the rivers that are designated wild and scenic, these little black lines all across the country. And you can see that all we've got here in Arizona is the Verde and Fossil Creek. However, if you look over here on this map, these are all the rivers that are considered eligible for designation within the nationwide rivers inventory. This is an official inventory of rivers that was agreed upon by Congress the last time in 1993, before things went really awry. And those rivers here in Arizona, there's quite a lot of rivers that are eligible for designation under wild and scenic policy. Not only are these rivers eligible for designation, but since 1993, all the federal land management agencies that have jurisdiction across the country have found another additional 3,000 to 6,000 miles of river eligible for designation. The list is being updated currently. So soon we'll have more maps that show all of those rivers. But just in the change from over here on the left, what is designated, to what's on the right, you can see there is great potential for expanding wild and scenic designation already here in the state. So that is one policy option that is being explored currently through the 30 by 30 campaign in Arizona. And as I said, it's now is the time. So if we look closely at the rivers and streams of Arizona, you can see that the whole state looks like it's covered with rivers. But most of these rivers are actually not perennial, or rivers that flow all year long. So the dark blue rivers are the perennial streams, but all those other little streams that you see in here are either ephemeral streams, which mean they only flow when there's some sort of precipitation or runoff event, or intermittent streams where maybe they're flowing in one section and then they disappear underground for a while and then they pop up somewhere else. So it's not a continuous flow of water within that stream system. Regardless of what type of stream it is, it's really important to think about expanding protections across all types of streams that are networks of intact streams. That have high rates of connectivity, because this is really important for meeting both societal and wildlife needs, especially in a changing climate. The connectivity is the key there. The free-flowing nature, whether there's water in it all year long, is not important, because when there is water, those ephemeral and intermittent streams are critical for wildlife and for getting water into the rest of the system for groundwater recharge purposes, or for filling reservoirs elsewhere in the system that humans depend on for water resources. So free-flowing rivers are also not just important for aquatic species, but they're also really important for terrestrial species that depend on them. So in Arizona, around 80% of invertebrates and 70% of threatened and endangered vertebrates depend on riparian areas throughout their life cycle. So riparian areas, if you're not familiar with that term, are those transition zones between the water in the river and the uplands. Like in this picture, that would be the top of those cliffs, right? Where the water doesn't flow up anymore. So those riparian areas are super critical because they have a diversity of species, plant species, that is unlike the plants that exist in those upland areas. And in the desert Southwest, it's really important to think about protecting these areas because only about 2% of the total land area is riparian areas. But when you have 80 to 70% of your species depending on those riparian areas, or 30 to 70% of bird species depending on those riparian areas during some part of their life cycle, they are critically important for wildlife. But a problem with our riparian areas is that they're really attractive, not just to all those native species, but they're also really attractive to livestock because they're sources of water and they're sources of really lush vegetative covering. So the livestock grazing, I will say unregulated and irresponsible ranching activities, is a major driver of degradation in these riparian areas. And you can see in this image here, this was in the upper Verde River, where cattle are down in the riparian area. They've stripped away all the vegetation from the banks. This leads to not only their footprints and all of their biophysical activities that are happening as they're eating and drinking, muddying the water and reducing the water quality. But it also leads to increasing temperatures in the river because they're not being shaded by that canopy, whether it's a high canopy or even a low canopy of shade that's provided by those riparian plants. It changes the temperature of the water. And when the temperature of the water changes, it affects the ability of the native species to be able to persist within that river system. So if you have species that like cold water, they're not going to like being around the areas where the cattle are. And there's less and less cold water habitat in our rivers in the Southwest as the temperatures are rising. So it's really important. One other thought is that riparian, by the cattle eating away the native species, it actually allows for invasive species to come in and take over where those native species once were, which leads to a change in what we call a vegetative assemblage, essentially the collection of different vegetation that live in these areas. So one solution is working with ranchers to reduce the points of access for these cattle or other type of livestock. We have other types of livestock ranching in the state, and just making it so that they can only access the river in certain areas so that their impact overall is reduced. Another option is to reduce the number of animals that are being grazed in a particular area at any given time. Another solution is to reduce the amount of time and the season in which these animals have access to the river. Obviously, in the winter time, when there's less green foliage and there are less animals trying to reproduce in that area, is a preferable time for these cattle to be in the river system. Less impact on the reproductive cycle of native species. Okay, so another way to deal with protecting both rivers and those riparian areas is upgrading GAP status. So a GAP status, to put it in real simple terms, is the way in which a particular unit of land is being managed. GAP 1 and 2 is managing specifically for biodiversity. GAP 3 is a multiple use mandate for those particular areas, and there's no species management. And GAP 4 is anything that's shown there in white, where it's unknown, it's unprescribed. So that can be private lands. It can be federal lands where there's no particular management strategy that's set out in one way or the other. So you'll notice here, there are some forests that are visible. You might say, well, that's a national forest. Why is it white? It's because there is no prescribed management plan for those particular areas. Okay. So overall, protecting and managing rivers and riparian areas for biodiversity not only protects the river and riparian area, but it can lead to benefits for all the adjacent terrestrial lands. And the literature shows that protecting terrestrial lands doesn't necessarily have reciprocal benefits for water. You can put a boundary around a park or a national forest and manage it for certain things, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's really going to protect all those riverine ecosystem services that we talked about that are so important. So this is a study that looked at the New Mexico an ecoregion here that spans across New Mexico and Arizona, specifically looking at riparian habitat for the narrow-headed garter snake. And any one of you that have heard me talk about this topic before knows that I think that this snake should be the mascot of the wild and scenic river system in this region, because it depends on free-flowing rivers and healthy riparian areas. It refuses to live along streams that are dammed or diverted so much that there's not a lot of water left in the river. It needs free-flowing rivers because it actually depends on native species that will only live in the free-flowing portions of rivers. So here in this larger map, you can see that the brown area is the actual range, inhabitable range of this species. Okay, so the brown area is what is reported as being the actual species or the actual range, but this snake will only live within a 1/4 mile of a river. It won't go outside of that 1/4 mile area. And when you designate a river wild and scenic, you can designate up to a 1/4 mile on either side of the river. Hence my argument that this snake makes a great mascot for wild and scenic designations in this region. And if you don't know the narrow-headed garter snake, it is a federally listed endangered species that lives in this area. It's not venomous, it's quite friendly, and it's really cute. So thinking about expanding wild and scenic designations in this region to protect this cute little mascot snake, we need to know what of this range is already protected, what is eligible for protection, and what of those eligible rivers actually stand to maintain their free-flowing nature and their riparian habitat in the face of climate change. So we did a study to understand that. And what we found was that this is what extent, if you can see here, the yellow lines are probably kind of faint on your screen, but there's a little over 1,000 kilometers of suitable and protected snake habitat in this region. There's over 2,200 kilometers of suitable but unprotected snake habitat in this region. That's what we know as the conservation gap, where there's gaps in protections. And then within that gap, over 900 kilometers of that snake habitat is eligible for wild and scenic designation through its listing on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory. So those of you in the room who care about reptiles or amphibians or any other kind of cute critter that likes riparian areas, think about getting those sections of rivers protected under this 30 by 30 campaign. And that would be a little more than 30% of this unprotected area. So that would be a great achievement if we could see those rivers designated. Okay, so some of you might not like snakes at all, but really love birds. Well, birds are like the snakes. They really like the riparian areas as well. It's a great place for them to find bugs to eat, to build their nests in that lush vegetation, to have water, to rest themselves as they're migrating with the seasons. So the Southwest willow flycatcher is probably a name you've heard if you like birds. It's an endangered species that's native to this area. And you can see here in the map that the range of the flycatcher is all of this green area. But these little yellow lines have been identified as critical habitat for that species. That means this is the area that the US government has identified, and different agencies and nonprofits have said these are the areas where these birds, we really need to protect these areas because this is where the birds are really flying and they need those areas to have healthy populations. And what you can see is that once again, all we've got is the Verde and Fossil Creek designated as wild and scenic. And the distinction here is blue is already designated. Kind of teal color are all those rivers that are on the nationwide rivers inventory that are eligible for designation. So you can see that we have actually quite a bit of critical habitat for the flycatcher that could get designated to protect that habitat in perpetuity. All right. Let's see. So other cute critters, beavers. So beavers, I don't know how many of you have seen beavers in the rivers in Arizona, and that's because they have largely been extirpated from their previous range due to hunting and for the fur trade and hunting, and also because they're considered a nuisance animal by ranchers and other landowners because they actually engineer the landscape. They change it. And you can see here in this graphic how they can engineer and change the landscape over time to help restore rivers. They are biological integrators of rivers and riparian areas that support biodiversity through their very advanced and very creative engineering prowess. Okay, so this is a degraded stream bed, which we have a lot of those in Arizona. We have a lot of very incised streams in this state, whether they're perennial or ephemeral. They're incised because something's been happening in that corridor to degrade them. Oftentimes it's a combination of or some activity related to ranching, forestry, tree harvesting, and even railroads that were put into the forests to help bring out the lumber that was being harvested. They're degraded by roads being built over them, any number of activities within stream corridors. So you get these very incised streams where the river itself is disconnected from the floodplain. You see that here. So a beaver comes in and builds a couple dams, and then what happens is that actually leads to the river kind of blowing out and expanding that area that's incised. And you think, well, why would you want to do that? You're trying to get the river back up to the floodplain. Well, the reason why is because through their long-term engineering, they actually make it over and over again that these dams fill in, sediment gets trapped in the reservoirs that they're creating, it fills them in, and over time, that area comes back up, gets the river to meet the floodplain, and you can see these nice braided channels here where the water is being distributed all throughout the area. It's giving it time to slow down and infiltrate into the ground, recharging groundwater. And look at all that lush vegetation that's growing around there because it's pulling from that groundwater that the beaver have provided for that to vegetation to thrive. So beaver also help, because beaver help to connect rivers with their floodplains, they distribute that water. Like I said, you can see here a stream without beavers where it's incised. The groundwater is localized basically right underneath that stream bed. When you have a stream with beavers and it's less incised and the water's getting spread out, the groundwater or water table there is spread out too. And those plants have their roots in the soil. Over here in drought conditions in an incised stream, well, look at all these plants. If they're not directly next to that water source, they're drying up. they're vulnerable. They're not resistant to that drought. But over here, some of them, some of them dry up, some of them don't make it, but the bulk of that vegetation stays resistant to the drought. And why this is really critically important, especially in the state of Arizona, but all over the world, really, at this point in time, we know that with climate change, we're going to have more frequent and intense fires. And we have a condition in Arizona where our forests have been managed under different auspices for over 100 years, in which we suppressed fires, thinking that that was the best thing to do. And now we know that actually having regular fires is a good thing to keep our forests healthy. We're trying to restore them to get back to that natural fire regime where we're not having huge catastrophic fires, right? That's happening in our forests. But even in our desert environments, we're seeing that because of this invasion of species that are high, that have a higher propensity for burning, we're getting more forest fires even in, say, the Sonoran Desert, for example, where the native species aren't fire adapted because fire wasn't a normal condition in that area. And so as we have more invasive species in the area, we're getting more fires, which put the native species at risk. So if you can keep your rivers connected and those riparian areas, then you actually can help to reduce the risk of fire in river corridors. And the plants that are there are more resistant to the fires, and they tend to bounce back faster, or they're more resilient if they are struck by a fire. And I haven't had a chance to get into Fossil Creek, but my colleagues who work down there said that, despite the giant fire that just happened over the fall, the whole canyon itself burned, but the river corridor itself stayed pretty intact in terms of the vegetation. And so that's a great example. I just need to get some pictures so I can share them with you. It's a great example how protecting that riparian corridor and really enhancing the qualities in that corridor helped the stream be more resilient to that fire. So these photos are not taken in Arizona, but these are taken in southern Utah, so very similar environments. These scenes are not unlikely in Arizona. And with protected and restored rivers that have beaver habitat, Arizona can actually have healthy riparian areas, restore wet meadows like you see here with these elk, or wetland areas, have this very healthy assemblage of riparian vegetation. This is a beaver den that would be underwater during high water. This den is a signal that this incised stream channel has a chance of actually recovering. And during times of fire, those riparian areas provide refuge for habitat, not just the aquatic species, but all the terrestrial species that can actually get in there until that fire is over. Okay, so Beaver Range. This entire area was once Beaver Range, but like I said, they've been extirpated from a lot of areas. So protecting rivers where beaver are present and reducing them or reintroducing them to areas where they've been extirpated can enable this, what we call keystone species, to provide and enhance ecosystem services and wildlife habitat. I haven't heard yet of current activities to do so here in Arizona, but I know that in southern Utah, in southeastern Utah in particular, there have been a lot of efforts at restoring or increasing beaver populations specifically for all the reasons that I just mentioned. And I know there's a study here at NAU that's about to get underway that's looking at opportunities across the state to engage in those activities. So in your advocacy efforts and in your campaigns, this might be something that you might want to encourage for the restoration of beaver. Otter are cute and playful, and they're also apex predators. They keep a balance in freshwater ecosystems, and there are sentinels for water quality. They actually cannot survive in water bodies that have much pollution in them. And so with the characteristics of the otter, you can interpret the presence of an otter in a watershed as that watershed actually being quite healthy with good water quality and an abundance of life, because they're hungry. They like to eat a lot. They also share the same dens as beavers oftentimes. And I would say that it is something to consider that they have a pretty voracious appetite, because they can help to keep the populations of invasive species like crayfish and other invasive fish in check to help support the species populations of the native species that we're trying to recover across the state. And in a few minutes, I'll show you some numbers that relate to fish populations. But what's important here is to see that this all used to be otter range, and now otters only exist in this portion of the Verde River. And this is protected. These are eligible for protection. So the idea is that let's go ahead and protect those rivers that have otter and think about reintroducing them in areas that no longer have otter. And there have been very successful reintroduction campaigns in northern New Mexico in the Rio Grande Valley, where they were also extirpated. They were reintroduced in the early 2000s, and their populations have bloomed in that river system, all up and down through the areas where the river is actually connected. So we've seen those successes, and this would be a great initiative here in Arizona to help keep our rivers healthy. So one thing to think about is that many Native nations consider both the beaver and the otter as being sacred, especially the beaver, because they have the potential to shape the land and to create perennial, that all year long water source in places where there are intermittent streams or where there are ephemeral streams. And so this particular map is just looking at the range of otter related to tribal lands, with the idea that in New Mexico, it was actually the Taos Pueblo that reintroduced the otter on their land. So working with tribes can actually be beneficial for trying to reintroduce otter or beaver here in the state of Arizona. Collaborating with Native nations is also really important when we think that, first of all, in Arizona, there are 21 federally recognized tribes, and Native nations have land and water management practices that are grounded in millennia of scientific assessment and adaptation. Indigenous ecological knowledge, or traditional ecological knowledge, TEK as it's known, has been passed down for generations and contains so much knowledge and practices and beliefs about all the interconnected relationships between living things, including the humans, right, that facilitate abundant and resilient plant and fish and wildlife populations. And so it's really not surprising that indigenous territories are known to be some of the most biodiverse territories in the whole world, including here in the United States. So here in Arizona, you can see in this map that indigenous territories contain some of the last free-flowing rivers in the region. So collaborating with Native nations will be key to achieving the conservation goals that many of you have here in the room. One relatively new emerging policy for protecting river systems is known as rights of rivers. This is a rapidly expanding policy all around the world in areas that have large indigenous populations. And it's because the worldview of many indigenous peoples is that humans are not separate from nature, and they recognize the interdependence of all aspects of the environment. And so bestowing rights on a river, such as human rights, enables people to protect all the various aspects of those rivers that are vital for survival and for cultural purposes. And so rights of rivers has been bestowed on several rivers already here in the United States, and it is expanding across the country as well as around the globe. So one option for seeking protection of some of our river systems and water sources in this state would be to work with Native nations and with groups such as your own to try to see the rights of rivers bestowed on some of the rivers of concern. This is switching gears just a minute to look at dams and how they truncate rivers and reduce connectivity. You can see in this image all of the red spots. These are reservoirs across the state of Arizona that are reducing connectivity. And so removing and restoring stretches of free-flowing rivers is also critical for restoring connectivity that can enhance water security, ecosystem services, including that habitat. And this is really important when you're considering that in Arizona alone, 90% of the native fish species are now extinct, extirpated, or listed as endangered. In the lower Colorado River Basin, so that's where Arizona is, 75% of fish species are listed under the Endangered Species Act due to the compounding impacts of hydrologic alteration through dams and diversions, the draining of wetland areas, the introduction of invasive species, and all sorts of land modifications. And you can see here, these are some numbers from both the Rio Grande and the Colorado River. But what's important here is to look at 30% of the Colorado pike minnow range has been reduced, 25% of the Gila trout, 30% of the razorback sucker. And as much as we hear about the humpback chub, it's a little surprising to see that it's less than 1% of its habitat, or 1% of its range has declined. But the problem is that what is its range has been altered so severely through those temperature changes that they can't really thrive in those areas. So what we can see here is that there's a lot of rivers on the nationwide rivers inventory, a lot of miles of rivers in the habitat or in the range of these rivers or of these fish. So if we can protect these free-flowing river stretches, then we have a pretty good chance of trying to maintain the populations of these beloved and endangered or threatened fish species. So I'm going to end on this slide with the idea of securing in-stream flows for fish and wildlife. We started off the introduction this evening with a discussion about the need for securing in-stream flows. So to address the fish needs, as well as the riparian habitat needs, as well as all the other ecosystem services that come along with having free-flowing rivers, in-stream flows can have a really significant social, economic, and environmental positive impacts or outcomes. So for instance, in securing in-stream flows while restoring, diversifying, and replicating habitat for is essential for biodiversity and species resilience. And those in-stream flows can protect the natural capital that we talked about, the ecosystem service provision. It leads to water security at a basin scale, not just in little stream stretches. So one way to push for securing in-stream flows is to invoke the public trust responsibility of the government to protect these riverine resources for current and future generations, to conserve, to develop and apply in-stream flow policies for future allocations while thinking about or reconsidering past allocations to really achieve those conservation goals. So to conclude, we really need to be thinking in a multifaceted, multiscalar, interdisciplinary approaches for the river conservation and restoration goals that you all have. I'm gonna stop sharing now and go ahead and open up the floor to any questions that you may have.
Okay, thanks, Danielle. That is really fantastic. A lot of great stuff there. So let me review some of the questions that people posed in the chat. Okay, Anne wants to know if the agua fria or some of it is eligible for wild and scenic status. She says a little bit is perennial, I think, but I think there's an application on file, but she's not sure. Do you know the status of the agua fria?
I am going to pull up a spreadsheet here that has some names on it and let you know the answer to that question in a couple minutes once I track it down. In the meantime, I might take another question if you don't mind me looking at two things at once to find out.
Okay, let's see. Emery is commenting that my understanding is that we have lost the CCC dams on the rim from the 1930s. I think that means Civilian Conservation Corps.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not understanding, is there a question? It was just, are you referring to the map that showed the different reservoirs across the state?
Well, I think he's looking for confirmation that those CCC dams on the rim have been removed or something. Do you know anything about that?
I actually don't know. I don't know about those dams in particular. I have heard of some small dams being removed and rivers restored in the area, very small dams. But I haven't heard of any large scale dam removal. So it would depend on that. I can look into it. I don't know for sure.
And then there's several comments here. Thank you for a wonderful, inspiring presentation. I agree with that. So Sandy is asking, why do you think Arizona Game and Fish does not more aggressively pursue restoration of beavers and otters, especially considering all the benefits they provide?
Remember when I said that they're considered nuisance animals by ranchers and landowners because they do engineer the land? They can, if you already have built environment, we'll say, in your land that you own. So you have houses, for instance, in the land, and it's within a riparian or a watershed, river corridor. If the beaver come in, they can actually lead to flooding of your house, right? So they can be considered nuisance. And I know that has happened in areas where there's streams that are really, really close to people's houses. in New Mexico. I'm more familiar with beaver there because there's quite a bit of them in that region. And so what happens is people will come in and they'll take those beaver and they'll move them to areas that are less populated. And they're actually moving them to some of these beaver restoration sites. I think that Arizona Fish and Game is probably up against some resistance to ranchers, for example, people who own their own ranches who don't want to see the shape of their lands changed. If they're trying to maximize the area in which their cattle can graze, having a beaver come in that actually makes a pond and increases a wetland area takes away from the cattle grazing potential in that area, although it does provide a water source. So it's that trade-off. But I did say that there is a study that is underway now, getting started here in the School of Forestry, specifically looking at areas in the state of Arizona that would be ideal for restoring those beavers. So stand by for a report sometime in the near future.
Well, I want to offer a suggestion for a great place to start restocking beavers, and that would be the Upper Verde. In 2006, the Nature Conservancy commissioned Prescott College professor Walt Anderson to do a beaver population study on the Upper Verde, and I can send you the results of that. But they found a beaver colony every kilometer along the first 25 miles of the river, which is really cool. The problem is that they are now no longer there. They've all gone. And beaver populations tend to do these boom and bust cycles. Most rodent populations do that, but we don't have an explanation for where all the beavers went. Sometimes people think it's because they ate all their food up. That's not the case. So here's a great question that needs some study and a great place to restore beavers.
I agree. That's a great case. Now, my research on beavers show that they can actually maintain populations in an area for thousands of years. So I'm curious whether or not they ate up all their food, or whether somebody thought, let's get these out of here, or it was a combination. Maybe it was a drought year where there wasn't a lot of, I don't know. It would be really interesting to see what happened to those beaver. Yeah, absolutely. So I just looked up the Agua Fria, and there is a very small stretch of the Agua Fria that is on the NRI, on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory. It's kind of in the upper stretches of the headwater areas of the Agua Fria. There's a small stretch that's in a nice bend in the river that's eligible. But remember that was last updated in 1993, and it very well could be that more of it has been found eligible since that time. So if you give me a second, I will look for that.
I'll also join in that the San Pedro has had beaver restoration for going on almost 20 years now. And they did well. Then they did drop in population, but they dispersed. And now some of them have been discovered to have moved upstream into Mexico. So they are here and doing their job. And there were some very interesting studies done about beaver reintroduction on the San Pedro.
Great.
Just Danielle, that was Tricia Girardet, a indefatigable, determined defender of the San Pedro.
Yes, I know that.
And a great ally of our effort to work on rivers. Let me just give another little news thing on the 30 by 30 wild and scenic rivers status in Arizona. In 1993, the Arizona Rivers Coalition did a study on eligible rivers in Arizona. And that whole effort kind of died and never resulted in any proposals. The 30 by 30 word group is rebuilding that and using that as a basis for developing proposals for many wild and scenic rivers in Arizona over the next few years. We're working on that. This is a great and good thing.
That is great. Okay, so I don't remember who it was who asked whether or not the Agua Fria is eligible, but you will be happy to know that according to the updated eligibility list, that nearly all of the Agua Fria and its tributaries are eligible. So Larry Creek, Lousy Canyon, Tank Creek, Bishop Creek, Silver Creek, Indian Creek, Sycamore, Little Ash, and Ash Creek are all eligible. So there you go. That's a good campaign to get on or to start.
So are there any other comments or questions here? We've got
Sandy Barr has a question in there. Another one. To increase the number of wild.
Oh, I see that. Okay. So to increase the number of wild and scenic rivers in Arizona, wouldn't we need to get one or both of our US senators on board? Is anyone talking to them about it?
So yes, the answer to your question is that you need the senators or House representatives to champion a bill, introduce a bill to Congress for the designation. But that doesn't usually happen until after a campaign has been built. And a wild and scenic campaign can take 5 to 10 years before it fully matures to the point of getting it introduced to Congress and making its rounds through however many sessions it takes to get that final designation. And a senator or a House rep is not going to put forth a bill until they know for sure that a certain percentage of their constituents support such a bill, because they're not going to risk their political careers on saving the rivers if the people who vote for them are going to use that as a reason not to reelect them. So it takes a lot of time to build support within the constituents before that bill can get introduced. But I know that there are people working on building campaigns for wild and scenic designations across the state. It's a fledgling, I will say it's kind of some of the campaigns are more mature, like the Upper Verde, but then in other areas, they're kind of fledgling campaigns and they're just getting started. And I think that Gary could probably give you a little bit of information if you're interested in getting involved in that 30 by 30 wild and scenic initiative.
At this point, we're not quite ready to do volunteers, but when we are, I will email all of you that signed up for this webinar, because you're obviously interested in rivers. We really appreciate that interest. But I think within a few months, we will need some volunteer field auditors to go and look at some of all those rivers that were in that 1993 report that we've updated. We need to do some field checking. So you can send me an email at yavapaiSierra@gmail.org. And I will put you on a list and make sure to notify you of that. And I'll put that in the chat, okay?
Can Danielle share that updated spreadsheet that she referred to when she named off the newer areas of the Agua Fria that were eligible. If that's available to share publicly, that
Yeah.
would be great, I think. Then all of us can look for our own areas.
Absolutely. This is actually available online through rivers.gov is a website that is managed by all of the people who work with wild and scenic rivers in the country, the Interagency Coordinating Council for Wild and Scenic Rivers. So you can go on this website and zoom into your location and it will tell you where all the other eligible and suitable rivers are. What we're working on now is actually merging these data sets with the data that I use in my lab to do all this other analysis. So I don't have it merged yet, but we're working on that now. So here you go. You can click on that link and zoom right into Arizona and see all of them that have been found eligible and suitable. There's quite a
Wonderful.
lot.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Perfect.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, then we'll wind this up and everybody can go get dinner and enjoy the rest of your evening and think about rivers and how important they are. And I just want to really thank Danielle for this presentation. You know, bringing all this together with this energy and enthusiasm is so helpful, very important. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
With
Danielle.
that,
Fantastic.
Thank
we'll
you.
end the webinar and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.